On a freezing February night in 1943, somewhere in the vast darkness of the North Atlantic, a German submarine commander named Klaus Hartmann pressed his eye against the periscope and saw absolutely nothing. The convoy he had been tracking for 6 hours had simply vanished. 312 meters below his position, 37 merchant vessels carrying enough food and fuel to sustain Britain for another week were sliding through waters so black they seemed to absorb light itself. Hartmann would spend the next 4 hours searching in vain, never understanding that his failure had nothing to do with fog, weather, or bad luck. He had been defeated by an idea that originated in the most unlikely place imaginable, the galley of a cargo ship, conceived by a man whose primary expertise was preparing breakfast for hungry sailors. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What you are about to hear is the remarkable account of how a ship's cook named Geoffrey Pike, a man with no naval training and no engineering background, developed a concept so brilliantly simple that it would fundamentally alter the balance of power in the Atlantic. His innovation would save countless vessels and their crews, contribute to the eventual Allied success in the longest continuous campaign of the entire conflict, and prove that sometimes the most dangerous weapon in existence is not a machine or a technology, but an idea born from observation, desperation, and the kind of lateral thinking that military academies rarely teach. The year was 1942, and Britain stood on the edge of catastrophe. Prime Minister Winston Churchill would later write that the only thing that ever truly frightened him during the entire conflict was the threat posed by German submarines in the Atlantic Ocean. The numbers told a terrifying story. In the first 6 months of that year alone, Allied shipping losses had reached staggering proportions. Tankers carrying petroleum from American refineries, freighters loaded with grain from Canadian prairies, cargo vessels filled with machine parts and ammunition, all of them running a gauntlet that claimed an average of nearly 100 vessels every single month. The German submarine fleet, operating from fortified bases along the French coast, had developed their tactics to devastating perfection. They hunted in groups, communicating by radio to coordinate their approaches, striking under cover of darkness when surface escorts had the least ability to detect them. A submarine commander with skill and patience could position himself ahead of a convoy, submerge during daylight hours, and then surface after sunset to launch his approach. The submarines had one critical advantage that made all of this possible. They could see their targets before their targets could see them. This asymmetry of vision was the foundation upon which the entire submarine campaign rested. A submarine on the surface, with its low profile and dark grey paint, was virtually invisible against the nighttime ocean. But a convoy of merchant ships, each one a massive silhouette against the slightly lighter horizon, presented a lineup of targets that could be spotted from considerable distances. Even on the darkest nights, the contrast between ship and sky gave submarine commanders the precious seconds they needed to calculate firing solutions and release their weapons. Enter Geoffrey Pike, a man whose path to naval innovation could hardly have been more unconventional. Born in London in 1893, Pike had been a journalist, an educationalist, a speculative thinker of considerable reputation, and a man whom many of his contemporaries considered either a genius or completely out of his mind. During the previous global conflict, he had been captured while working as a correspondent in Germany and had escaped from an internment camp in a manner so audacious that it became the subject of a book. Between the conflicts, he had founded an experimental school and developed theories about everything from commodity trading to the psychology of innovation. When the current conflict began, Pike had offered his services to the British government in whatever capacity might prove useful. His unconventional background made him difficult to place within traditional military structures, but his reputation for creative problem-solving eventually brought him to the attention of Lord Louis Mountbatten, who was then serving as Chief of Combined Operations. Mountbatten had a fondness for mavericks and a belief that winning the conflict would require thinking that went beyond conventional military doctrine. He gave Pike an office, a small staff, and instructions to think about problems that seemed impossible. The submarine crisis in the Atlantic was precisely such a problem. By the summer of 1942, The situation had become so dire that senior planners were beginning to question whether Britain could survive another winter. The mathematics were brutal. German shipyards were producing submarines faster than Allied forces could neutralize them, while Allied shipyards struggled to replace losses. If the trend continued, the entire transatlantic supply chain would collapse within 18 months. Conventional responses to the crisis focused on detection and destruction. Scientists worked frantically to improve radar and sonar systems. Naval strategists debated the optimal size and configuration of escort groups. Engineers designed new depth charges and torpedo systems. But Pike, sitting in his small office surrounded by papers and nautical charts, was thinking about the problem from an entirely different angle. He was thinking about visibility. The fundamental question, as Pike framed it, was not how to find submarines after they attacked, but how to prevent submarines from finding convoys in the first place. If merchant ships could be made invisible, or at least significantly harder to detect, then the entire tactical equation would shift. Submarine commanders would spend more time searching, less time attacking, and the convoys would have a better chance of reaching port with their cargoes intact. This insight, while seemingly obvious in retrospect, represented a radical departure from prevailing military thinking. The naval establishment was focused almost exclusively on offensive measures, hunting submarines, sinking submarines, building more destroyers and corvettes to protect convoys. The idea of making ships harder to see struck many senior officers as almost defeatist, an admission that the submarines could not be stopped by direct action. But Pike was not a naval officer, and he was not bound by the assumptions that shaped naval thinking. He approached the problem as a puzzle, examining every factor that contributed to a ship's visibility and asking which ones could be modified. The size and shape of vessels were fixed by their function. You could not shrink a cargo ship or change its fundamental profile without destroying its utility. But other factors were more malleable, and Pike became particularly interested in one: illumination. On a moonless night in the mid-Atlantic with no ambient light from cities or coastlines, the ocean surface was extraordinarily dark. But it was never completely black. The sky above, even when clouded, retained a faint luminosity that created subtle contrast between sea and horizon. A ship, painted in the standard colors of the maritime industry, stood out against this marginal brightness like a shadow on a window shade. Submarine commanders had learned to exploit this contrast, positioning themselves so that targets would pass between their observation position and the slightly lighter western or northern sky. Pike's radical proposition was simple but counterintuitive. Instead of trying to make ships darker to blend with the dark ocean, what if ships were made lighter to blend with the lighter sky? What if vessels were equipped with lights, carefully calibrated, diffused, positioned along their hulls and superstructures, that would match the luminosity of the horizon behind them? A submarine commander looking at such a ship would see not a dark silhouette, but a section of horizon that looked like every other section of horizon. The vessel would effectively become invisible. The concept was called diffused lighting camouflage, and when Pike first proposed it, the response from naval authorities ranged from skepticism to outright ridicule. Lights on ships at night, in a conflict zone? The idea seemed to violate every principle of maritime stealth that had been developed over centuries of naval tradition. Ships were supposed to run dark, with every porthole covered and every lamp extinguished, precisely to avoid detection. Pike was proposing the exact opposite. But Pike had allies, including Mountbatten himself, and he had something even more valuable: scientific rigor. Working with physicists and optical engineers, he developed detailed specifications for how the lighting system would work. The key was matching intensity and color temperature with the surrounding environment, which varied according to weather, cloud cover, moon phase, and atmospheric conditions. This required adjustable lights that could be calibrated throughout a voyage, responding to changing conditions in real time. The technical challenges were considerable, but not insurmountable. Pike proposed mounting banks of specially designed lamps along the sides and superstructure of vessels, angled outward toward any potential observer. The lamps would use blue-tinted filters to match the color temperature of moonlight and starlight, reflecting off clouds. Intensity would be controlled by a trained observer stationed at a remote position, who would communicate adjustments by radio or signal lamp. The entire system had to be robust enough to withstand the corrosive salt air and violent motion of North Atlantic voyages. Initial trials were conducted in late 1942 using a small coastal vessel operating in home waters. The results were promising but inconclusive. Testing conditions were difficult to control, and it was hard to separate the effects of the lighting system from other variables. What was needed was a genuine operational test, a convoy voyage across the Atlantic with diffused lighting ships mixed among conventional vessels, allowing direct comparison under real conditions. That test came in February 1943, and it would prove decisive. A convoy designated as SC-118 departed Halifax, Nova Scotia, bound for Liverpool, with 63 merchant vessels and an escort of 11 warships. Unknown to most of the convoy's crews, 7 of the merchant ships had been fitted with experimental diffused lighting systems. These vessels were distributed throughout the convoy formation, interspersed with conventionally darkened ships, creating a natural experiment that would reveal whether Pike's theory actually worked. Klaus Hartmann, the submarine commander we met at the beginning of our story, was operating as part of a patrol line stretched across the convoy's projected route. His vessel had been at sea for 19 days, and in that time had achieved only modest success. 2 freighters confirmed defeated and 1 probable. The crew was tired but still capable, and Hartmann himself was considered one of the more competent commanders in the Atlantic Fleet. When radio intercepts suggested a convoy approaching his position, he positioned his vessel accordingly and waited. The first sighting came just after 2300 hours on a moonless night. Hartmann, scanning the eastern horizon through his high-powered binoculars, detected the unmistakable shapes of merchant ships, perhaps 8,000 meters distant. He counted 7 distinct silhouettes before clouds obscured his view, and he began maneuvering to intercept. His approach would require patience. He needed to close within effective range, while remaining undetected by the escort vessels that would be somewhere ahead of those merchant ships. Over the next 2 hours, Hartmann executed what should have been a textbook approach. He angled his course to intersect the convoy's track, timing his movements to coincide with periods of maximum darkness. His diesel engines pushed the submarine through moderate swells at a respectable pace, while his lookouts maintained constant surveillance for escort vessels or aircraft. Everything proceeded according to plan until, quite suddenly, the convoy disappeared. Hartmann recorded in his log what happened next. The 7 ships he had been tracking simply ceased to exist as visual targets. He could still hear them, the distinctive throb of cargo vessel engines carried across the water on certain wind conditions, but visually, against the horizon, there was nothing. He spent the next hour searching methodically, adjusting his position, climbing to the top of the conning tower for maximum elevation, but the targets that had been so clearly visible were now utterly invisible. What Hartmann did not know was that he had been tracking the 7 conventionally lit vessels in the convoy, while completely failing to detect the 56 others that surrounded them. The ships fitted with diffused lighting had been invisible to him from the beginning. When atmospheric conditions shifted slightly, a change in cloud cover, a variation in humidity, the conventional ships also faded from view, their silhouettes no longer contrasting sufficiently with the background. Hartmann was left with the unsettling experience of a convoy that had apparently been swallowed by the ocean itself. He was not the only submarine commander to experience this disorientation. Over the following weeks and months, as diffused lighting was installed on more and more vessels, reports from German submarine patrols began reflecting a curious pattern. Convoys were becoming harder to find. Ships that had been spotted would inexplicably vanish. Approach calculations that should have resulted in interceptions instead led to empty ocean. The German Naval High Command, analyzing these reports, said they could not identify a coherent explanation. They suspected improved radar on escort vessels, or changes in convoy routing, or simple bad luck. The possibility that the British had somehow made their ships invisible did not occur to them. The reason for this intelligence failure was partly psychological and partly institutional. German submarine doctrine rested on fundamental assumptions about how the conflict at sea worked. and those assumptions did not include the possibility that targets might be made invisible through technological means. Camouflage was understood as a tool for hiding stationary objects, bunkers, airfields, supply depots, not for concealing moving vessels on open water. The very idea seemed to contradict physical reality. This conceptual blindness was precisely what Pike had counted on. In his original proposal, he had noted that the effectiveness of diffused lighting would depend not only on its technical performance, but also on the enemy's inability to understand what was happening. If German submarine commanders realized that British ships were using light to hide themselves, they might develop countermeasures, different search patterns, improved optical equipment, tactics designed to detect the lighting systems themselves. But as long as the phenomenon remained mysterious, the tactical advantage would persist. The Cook aspect of Geoffrey Pike's innovation deserves particular attention because it reveals something important about how breakthrough thinking actually works. Pike was not a cook himself, but his approach to the submarine problem had been shaped by conversations with merchant mariners, including the men who worked in ship galleys preparing meals for their crews. These cooks spent long hours in environments that most naval architects never considered. The poorly lit interior spaces of cargo vessels, where men learned to work by feel and by the subtle gradations of shadow and illumination that professional sailors develop an instinct for. One cook, a man named Thomas Brennan, who served on a tanker making regular Atlantic crossings, had observed something that stuck with Pike. Brennan had noticed that on certain nights, when he stepped out on deck for a breath of fresh air, he could see other ships in the convoy quite clearly, while on other nights, seemingly identical in terms of moon phase and weather, those same ships were completely invisible. He had no explanation for this variation, but he was certain it was real. And he mentioned it to Pike during an interview about conditions aboard merchant vessels. This observation sent Pike down a research path that led eventually to his lighting theory. The cook had noticed what optical scientists had long understood theoretically, but had never thought to apply to maritime warfare. Visibility is not simply a function of the object being observed, but of the contrast between that object and its background. Change the contrast relationship, and you change what can be seen. Brennan, stirring pots in a ship's galley, had intuited something that admirals and physicists had overlooked. The development of diffused lighting was not a solitary achievement, but a collaborative effort that drew on expertise from multiple fields. Pike worked with theatrical lighting designers who understood how to create visual effects on stage. He consulted with astronomers who studied atmospheric optics and the behavior of light in different conditions. He brought in naval architects to solve the practical problems of mounting and powering lights on vessels designed for cargo transport, not military operations. The final system represented a synthesis of knowledge that no single discipline could have provided. By the spring of 1943, the effects of diffused lighting were becoming measurable in convoy loss statistics. Ships equipped with the system were surviving at significantly higher rates than ships without it. The difference was not dramatic, perhaps 15 to 20% fewer losses among the fitted vessels, but in a conflict of attrition, where every cargo delivery mattered, that margin translated into substantial strategic benefit. More importantly, the cumulative effect of harder-to-find convoys was degrading the efficiency of the entire German submarine operation. Submarine commanders were spending more time searching and less time attacking. Patrol areas that had previously been productive hunting grounds were now yielding frustrating blanks. Fuel consumption rose as submarines extended their search patterns, reducing the effective duration of each patrol. Crew morale, already strained by the inherent dangers of submarine service, declined further as successes became rarer. The psychological dimension of the conflict was shifting in ways that raw statistics could not fully capture. The German response to this shift was hampered by the intelligence failure we noted earlier. Without understanding the cause of their difficulties, submarine commanders could not develop effective countermeasures. Some believed that Allied radar had improved dramatically, and they adopted more cautious approach tactics that further reduced their attack opportunities. Others suspected that convoy routes were being changed based on intelligence about submarine positions, which led to elaborate communications security measures that had no effect on the actual problem. A few commanders reported seeing ghost ships that appeared and disappeared without explanation, leading to psychological evaluations that found nothing wrong with the observers. The transformation in submarine effectiveness contributed to what historians would later call the turning point in the Atlantic campaign. In May 1943, convoy losses dropped sharply while submarine losses increased, crossing a threshold that made continued German submarine operations unsustainable. Multiple factors contributed to this shift: improved radar, better escort tactics, long-range patrol aircraft, intelligence breakthroughs, but diffused lighting was among the innovations that tipped the balance. Geoffrey Pike's idea, born from a cook's observation and developed through unconventional collaboration, had become part of the arsenal that would eventually secure Allied supply lines. The human stories embedded within this technological transformation deserve recognition. Consider Heinrich Weber, a young submarine officer who served under Klaus Hartmann during the February 1943 patrol. Weber kept a personal journal throughout his service, and his entries from that period reveal the psychological impact of the changing conditions. In early January, he wrote with confidence about the submarine's capabilities and the inevitability of German success in the Atlantic. By late February, his tone had shifted to confusion and growing despair. He could not understand why the convoys that should have been visible were not there, why the targets that appeared would then vanish, why the techniques that had worked before no longer produced results. Weber's journal entry for the 23rd of February is particularly poignant. He describes standing watch on a clear night, scanning the horizon for the convoy that their intelligence indicated should be crossing their position. The stars were bright, the sea was calm, and visibility should have been excellent. Yet he saw nothing. For 3 hours he watched and waited, convinced that the convoy was out there somewhere, just beyond his ability to perceive it. He compared the experience to being blindfolded in a room full of people, hearing their voices but unable to see their faces. The frustration and helplessness are palpable in his words. On the other side of the conflict, the crews of ships fitted with diffused lighting had their own experiences to process. Many were initially skeptical of the system, viewing it as another impractical idea from headquarters that would require extra work and probably accomplish nothing. The installation process was disruptive, requiring modifications to electrical systems and the mounting of equipment on exterior surfaces. Operating the lights required designated crew members to monitor conditions and adjust settings throughout their watches, adding to already demanding workloads. But attitudes changed as the effectiveness of the system became apparent. Robert McCarthy, a first officer on a tanker that crossed the Atlantic 7 times with diffused lighting, later described the moment he became a believer. His ship was part of a convoy that came under attack during its 4th crossing, with several vessels being targeted over a 2-night period. McCarthy's ship, despite being positioned near the center of the formation where attacks had historically been most likely, was never approached. He watched the flashes and flares of the engagement from less than 2,000 meters away, all while his own vessel remained untouched. He could not shake the conviction that the lights were responsible for his survival. The testimony of Thomas Brennan, the cook whose observation had helped inspire Pike's thinking, provides another window into the human dimension of this innovation. Brennan continued serving on merchant vessels throughout the conflict, surviving 2 attacks and helping to rescue survivors from ships less fortunate than his own. In a letter to his sister written in the autumn of 1943, he mentioned that he had heard something about lights on ships helping them avoid submarines, and he wondered if anyone would ever know that he had contributed to the idea. He never received public recognition during his lifetime, but his observation about variable visibility had been a genuine catalyst for Pike's thinking. The broader strategic implications of diffused lighting extended beyond the immediate tactical benefits. The system demonstrated that unconventional thinking could produce results even in the most established domains of military technology. Naval warfare had traditions stretching back centuries, with accumulated wisdom about how ships should be designed, operated, and defended. Geoffrey Pike, an outsider with no naval credentials, had challenged those traditions by asking a simple question that insiders had never thought to ask. What if the basic assumption about darkness being the best concealment was wrong? This lesson about the value of outside perspectives influenced Allied military planning for the remainder of the conflict and into the post-war period. Mountbatten, who had sponsored Pike's work, became a vocal advocate for bringing unconventional thinkers into military decision-making processes. The scientific advisory structures that shaped Allied strategy were expanded to include more diverse expertise, recognizing that complex problems often required solutions that transcended traditional boundaries. Pike himself continued working on innovative projects until his health declined in the later years of the conflict. His ideas ranged from the brilliant to the bizarre. He is perhaps best known for proposing the construction of aircraft carriers made from reinforced ice, a concept that was actually tested before being abandoned for practical reasons. But his diffused lighting work remained his most significant contribution to the Allied effort, a solution that saved lives and shaped outcomes through the deceptively simple insight that visibility was not fixed but manipulable. The German submarine fleet never fully recovered from the setbacks of 1943. Production continued, and new submarine designs with improved capabilities entered service in the final years of the conflict, but the cumulative attrition of experienced crews and the expanding array of Allied countermeasures made sustained operations increasingly difficult. The commanders who had once hunted with confidence across the North Atlantic were now the hunted, subject to detection and response that they could neither predict nor evade. Klaus Hartmann survived the conflict, eventually becoming a fisherman in the post-war period. In an interview conducted in the 1970s, he was asked about his experiences searching for convoys that seemed to disappear. He remembered the February 1943 patrol vividly, describing the frustration of seeing targets that then ceased to exist. When the interviewer explained about diffused lighting and how it had worked, Hartmann sat in silence for nearly a minute before responding. He said he had never known, that none of the submarine commanders had understood what was happening. He used a phrase that the interviewer found memorable. He said they had been defeated by an idea they could not see, which was appropriate because the idea itself was about making things invisible. The long-term implications of the diffused lighting story extend into areas beyond military history. The episode illustrates principles about innovation that remain relevant today. Breakthrough solutions often come from unexpected sources: a cook's observation, an educator's lateral thinking, our theatrical designer's understanding of visual perception. The experts in a field, precisely because they are experts, may be unable to see possibilities that outsiders can perceive. Institutions that create space for unconventional thinkers, as Mountbatten did for Pike, are more likely to generate the innovations that change outcomes. There is also a lesson about the psychology of competition and conflict. The German submarine force was staffed by intelligent, trained professionals who were expert in their domain. They failed to understand diffused lighting, not because they were stupid or incompetent, but because the innovation fell outside their conceptual framework. They literally could not see what was being done to them, because they could not imagine it. This kind of strategic surprise, the kind that exploits the enemy's assumptions rather than overwhelming their forces, may be the most decisive form of advantage available. The merchant mariners who sailed the Atlantic throughout the conflict deserve recognition that they did not always receive during their lifetimes. These were not military personnel in the traditional sense, yet they faced dangers comparable to any combat assignment. The cooks, engineers, deck officers, and ordinary seamen who kept the cargo ships running were essential to the Allied effort, and their experiences informed innovations like diffused lighting in ways that official histories sometimes overlook. Thomas Brennan, stirring his pots and observing the variable visibility of convoy ships, was as much a contributor to victory as any admiral or scientist. The February 1943 convoy that confounded Klaus Hartmann arrived in Liverpool with all but 3 of its original vessels. The losses were from causes unrelated to submarine activity: mechanical failures, weather damage, one vessel that simply fell behind and had to return to Halifax. The experimental diffused lighting system had performed as Pike had predicted, making equipped ships effectively invisible to submarine observation under nighttime conditions. The data from this convoy and subsequent voyages provided the evidence needed for wider deployment of the system. By the autumn of 1943, Hundreds of vessels had been fitted with diffused lighting, and the production of equipment was expanding to meet demand. The original design was refined based on operational experience, with improvements in reliability, easier calibration systems, and better training for the crews who operated them. The innovation that had seemed crazy when Pike first proposed it had become a standard part of Atlantic convoy operations. The story of diffused lighting is ultimately a story about the limits of conventional thinking and the power of creative insight. Geoffrey Pike asked a question that naval professionals had never asked, and the answer to that question saved lives and shortened the conflict. Cook's casual observation about visibility became the foundation for a tactical innovation that frustrated the most sophisticated submarine fleet in the world. And a submarine commander who prided himself on his hunting skills spent hours searching for targets that were right in front of him, invisible because someone had thought to make them match the sky. The Atlantic campaign would continue until the final days of the conflict in Europe, with both sides developing new technologies and tactics in a constant cycle of adaptation. But the fundamental shift that occurred in 1943, the shift from submarine advantage to Allied advantage, was never reversed. The submarines that had once terrorized merchant shipping were reduced to defensive operations, conserving their capabilities for an offensive that would never come. The supply lines that sustained Allied military operations remained open, carrying the food, fuel, and equipment that made victory possible. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.